Buongiorno, grazie per essere qui.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for being here.
L'integrazione europea è già davanti ai nostri occhi perché in Italia si comincia perfettamente puntuali, sembra di essere in Germania.
Because in Italy we're starting
forse
punctually.
questo è il
It
buon
looks as if
auspicio
you're in
per il
Germany,
resto
so sad,
del panel per il futuro
Maybe this is the
dell'Eurozona.
best
Allora,
hope
sono
of our
Ferdinando
panel for the future
Giuliano,
of the
editorialista a
Eurozone.
Bloomberg View,
I'm Ferdinando
e
Giuliano.
ho il piacere
I am Bloomberg
di
View editorialist.
appunto introdurre
And
un
I have the
panel
pleasure
di
to
assoluto
introduce
rilievo per parlare di un
panel
argomento
of
estremamente importante, così come mi è stato detto da un membro del pubblico che è venuto qui
important topic. Like a member of the public told me, he said he was looking forward to
già
listen
la
to
fine
this
del QE
panel.
è davanti a noi.
Allora,
parliamo di una parola, quantitative
So
easing, che pur essendo una parola straniera, complicata, di difficile comprensione, ha scatenato diciamo fortissime emozioni e contrasti all'interno dell'Europa. Si va da alcuni appunto settimanali, in particolare in Germania, che hanno presentato per esempio il presidente della Banca Centrale Europea Mario Draghi come una persona che si accendeva i sigari con biglietti da 100 euro, perché appunto il quantitative easing veniva visto come un modo di buttare denaro, di gonfiare bolle, creare troppa liquidità per quella che era necessaria per l'economia, a invece altri non so, giornali italiani che hanno sempre visto Draghi come una specie di salvatore dell'euro, anche la stampa internazionale che ha disegnato Draghi come un Super Mario, il cartone animato giapponese col berretto che va e ammazza i mostri della deflazione e appunto dell'economia stagnante. Poche parole sul quantitative easing. È stato lanciato a gennaio di 2 anni fa, con partenza poi a marzo. È uno schema di acquisto principalmente di titoli di Stato, ma poi anche di tutta una serie di per esempio sono inseriti i bond delle aziende, ci sono stati altri prodotti, in prodotti finanziari in quantità un po' più limitata, che prima 60 miliardi al mese, poi 80 miliardi al mese, ora di nuovo 60 miliardi al mese. E la cosa più importante, che è quella che discutiamo appunto ora, è che per ora si sa che andrà avanti fino alla fine dell'anno, dopo e molti appunto osservatori cominciano a ragionare su una possibile uscita da queste misure straordinarie. Ricordiamo, il quantitative easing è parte di un pacchetto di misure di stimolo all'economia, ci sono anche i tassi bassi o addirittura negativi nel caso del tasso sui depositi, c'è la promessa da parte della BCE di mantenere i tassi bassi a lungo, ci sono pacchetti di prestiti a tasso molto basso alle banche, questo è tutto un pacchetto molto complesso che rende anche un po' più difficile isolare l'effetto del quantitative easing per l'economia. Quel che però è certo, secondo la Banca Centrale Europea, è che il quantitative easing ha avuto un effetto molto importante, prima di tutto sull'inflazione. Ricordiamoci, la ragione per cui tutte queste misure sono state avviate era perché si temeva che la zona euro potesse entrare in un periodo di deflazione, quindi prezzi o stagnanti o addirittura in discesa, che sono un problema proprio perché inducono dei comportamenti sbagliati da parte dei consumatori e delle aziende. Se io so che i prezzi saranno più bassi domani, non compro nulla perché aspetto che venga domani. Il problema qual è? Che domani aspetto dopodomani, quindi non compro mai, questo dovrebbe portare a una stagnazione. Lo stesso avviene per le aziende, magari più conveniente aspettare, quindi non investono. Ma ovviamente quindi abbiamo visto una ripartenza sicuramente dell'inflazione negli ultimi mesi, grazie, va detto, anche a tutta una serie di altri fenomeni come il prezzo del petrolio, che prima si era abbassato e ora è ripartito. Però secondo la BCE l'effetto del quantitative easing sull'inflazione è stato molto importante. Anche sulla crescita si sono visti dei segnali importanti che di nuovo la BCE attribuisce a tutto questo pacchetto di misure. Come sappiamo, nel primo trimestre l'economia europea sta andando bene, abbiamo visto anche un dato molto incoraggiante, anche se un po' strano, sul PIL italiano, perché è salito lo 0,4% oltre le attese, però diciamo questo si inserisce in un contesto sicuramente positivo. Come dicevamo, questo potrebbe concludersi fra poco. Quali sono gli effetti per l'economia europea e soprattutto cosa va fatto a livello di zona euro per non rientrare in quella situazione di crisi che ci ha accompagnato per gran parte degli ultimi 6 anni, anche più in realtà, diciamo, nel 2011 già c'erano stati dei segnali prima di allora. Come si rafforza l'Eurozona in modo tale da renderla appunto meno vulnerabile a queste crisi? Per farlo appunto abbiamo un panel di assoluto rilievo. Alla mia destra c'è Lucrezia REICHLIN, che è professoressa alla London Business School, oltre che Presidente del Consiglio Scientifico di Bruegel, un'esperienza come capo della ricerca, Direttore Generale della Ricerca della Banca Centrale Europea, fa anche forecasting, quindi previsioni con la sua società Nowcasting Economics, e la leggete come sapete sul Corriere della Sera anche accanto a lei Jean PISANI-FERRY, che è professore di economia e management pubblico all'Art School of Government ed è stato commissario generale per la pianificazione strategica indipendenza del primo ministro francese. Negli ultimi mesi anni ha avuto anche si è speso molto come autore di parte del programma economico del nuovo presidente francese Macron, quindi ci potrà anche portare, diciamo, un aspetto più politico, e ovviamente è stato il fondatore e il direttore di Bruegel, che forse è una delle più importanti think tank economici a livello europeo. A mia sinistra Markus Brunnermeier, che è professore di economia a Princeton, con affiliazioni anche all'NBR, al CEPR ed ha lavorato come membro di comitati appunto scientifici sia per il Fondo Monetario, la Federal Reserve di New York, la Bundesbank e lo European Systemic Risk Board. Quello che faremo, avremo una serie di brevi interventi su una serie di appunto argomenti. Il panel lo terremo tutto in inglese in modo tale da permettere appunto quanto più interazione possibile fra i vari membri. Andremo avanti per un'oretta circa e poi lasceremo spazio alle vostre domande, che spero essere numerose. So I'll switch to English now if you want to put your headphones on. So I'll start with Lucrezia, and my question for Lucrezia is whether we are actually about to see QE end, whether the Eurozone economy is strong enough to see a withdrawal of QE, and yes, so your assessment of where Europe is at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Ferdinando. My English is very similar to my Italian, so I think I will be very comprehensible. Yes, where are we now? QE started, as you know, in 2015. It's not just the asset purchases, but also a series of other policy tools, the most important of which is the negative deposit rate. So we are in a situation in which the ECB is buying mostly government bonds, but also corporate bonds every month for 60 billion, and we also have a negative interest rates on deposit that commercial banks have at the central bank. So it's a situation of extreme, exceptional monetary policy measures. They were introduced in 2015 when actually growth had come back already in the euro area after very tough years, as you know, of growth close to zero, and for our economy in particular in Italy, negative growth. But inflation had been dangerously gone towards zero. So the situation, so we started end of 2014 and then 2015. Today we are in a very different situation. Not only the recovery is very convincing now, so we have had 16 quarters of continuous expansion in the euro area, so it's not just this quarter, it's 16 quarters of expansion. The euro area is growing at a faster rate than the US, which is really good news, because remember that the first in the years just before the great crisis, The euro area did very poorly with respect to the US. Now we are actually doing better. And actually, inflation is creeping up. So, as you know, I mean, QE should be understood as a measure for macroeconomic stability, not a measure to save the Italian states or to save Greece or to save whatever. It is a measure that has as target the inflation in the euro as a whole, okay? The ECB is bounded by the treaty to have an inflation rate which is close to 2% or just below 2%. So if we look just at the data, we see today that inflation is probably going to be, for 2017, 1.7, so very close to that target. So, you know, many people are saying, okay, so inflation is almost 2%, so maybe we are ready to go. We are ready to dismantle these measures, maybe gradually, and, you know, go back to normality. However, we have to look at other things. And first of all, inflation, the 2% target that the ECB is giving itself has to be not only a number for this quarter or for the last quarter, but it has to be a sustainable inflation, around 2% or just below 2%. And it has to be sustainable in a way that is not dependent on policy. So we don't want to be in a situation in which if the easy monetary policy is discontinued, then we go back to a very low inflation. So I think the ECB is looking at these three things. So the target, the durability of the, you know, the kind of the persistence of the numbers and the self-sustainability of these numbers. So I think these are the three things to look at. And then here is kind of the counter-argument for discontinuing the QE is that although we are now at 1.7, the very recent number in May have surprised on the negative. So we went from 1.9 to 1.4, so that was not so good. And also that the core inflation, which is a good predictor for the medium-term inflation, which is the inflation without the very volatile components, which is food and energy, is just below 1%. So inflation is back, but is not very convincingly back. And this has been actually forcibly argued by members, by Mario Draghi, but also other members of the executive boards at the ECB. And one thing that they have been looking at is, for example, wages. Now, wages are important because, you know, the wages are a predictor of inflation. This is how, you know, central banks look at wages. Now, since 2014, annual change in compensation per employee has been 1.2%. Now we are at 1.5%, and we are at 1.5%, sort of below the historical average in the euro area history, even if unemployment is going down and employment is going up. So we are in a very strange situation in which labor market is strengthening, not only growth, not only GDP, but labor market is strengthening, employment is increasing, but wages are not picking up. So why is this the case? So if you look at what kind of employment the euro area has created, 1/3 of this change of unemployment is temporary contracts, 1/4 is part-time employment. So employment is going up, but is very fragile. So it's a type of employment that does not create any pressure on wages because these people are very marginal in the labor market. So the hours overemployment, which is a very important indicator of the strength of the labor market, is actually flat, is not going up. So this, you know, makes me think and makes the ECB think that there is probably more slack in the economy than what is suggested by the GDP number. So, you know, the ECB obviously has a mandate in terms of inflation, so they are not as a target, they don't have employment, but these numbers of the labor market, you know, suggest that inflationary pressures are not convincingly back. So, having said that, I think that in the next June meeting, in a few days, when the ECB meet, they will present a new forecast, and I think that their message will be, okay, there is a strengthening of the euro area recovery, but the inflation numbers are not 100% convincing. They do not motivate an immediate exit. Having said that, however, the strengthening is there, so we can expect that in September they will start preparing for a gradual exiting, and we should maybe expect that in the second part of 2018 we will eventually see an exit from this extraordinary policy. So here there are two issues, and then I will leave the floor to Markus, who will get more in detail. How should we balance the risk of exiting too early or exiting too late? And also, the other issue is, should we first discontinue the asset purchases, or should we first increase the interest rate, the deposit rate, which is now negative? Now, the ECB has communicated, and unless they've changed their mind recently, that they are actually targeting not just one interest rate, but the whole yield curve. So they are looking at the difference between the long-term and the short-term interest rate. And for that reason, they would like to exit QE first, which has an effect on the long-term rate, and then go on the short rate. So I think we should look at this signal, and we should expect a low interest rate for a longer time, but maybe QE, as I said, in the beginning of 2018. Obviously there are some risk in exiting, especially for countries which, like our countries, have high debt and rely on long-term low interest rates for refinancing our debt. However, I think that the moment in which the ECB will exit, it will also be a moment in which the economy will be strong enough. So I think that maybe this risk should be not to emphasize too much, but definitely there are delicate issues of how you'll calibrate the exit. And I think that this is what Markus is going to talk about.
Okay. Markus has a short presentation as well, and the question is precisely the first one which Lucrezia asked, which is, how do we exit all of this?
Thanks a lot, Ferdinando. Let me just add to one of your comments where Mario Draghi was lighting a cigar with euro notes. By doing so, he of course reduces money supply and actually decreases inflation. Anyway, so what Lucrezia already mentioned, what I will focus on is there are two ways you can get out of the unconventional monetary policy. So on the one hand, we have a negative interest rate deposit rate, so ECB sets the interest rate negative, so you can actually increase the interest rate, or you can actually reduce quantitative easing, or even go in the opposite direction and sell off the bonds the ECB has bought. And then the question is, how would you sell it off? And this has different implications for the yield curve and different implications for the economy. And I would like to just spend some few words on this, which ways one could go and what are the different implications, without giving a clear recommendation. There is one concept I've worked on is the reversal interest rate. And the argument of the reversal interest rate is essentially that, there is an interest rate. If you go below this reversal interest rate, then actually monetary policy becomes ineffective. It becomes even worse. It reverses the effect. So essentially of becoming accommodative, it becomes contractionary. And the argument essentially is that you ruin part of the banking system because you decapitalize the banking system, and then the banking system cannot lend anymore to the real economy. And that's actually is bad for the economy. So one thing to watch out for is how does interest rate policy, the negative interest rate in particular, how does this affect the bank's lending behavior? So that's essentially what the first thing, and if you focus very much on that, you would say, let's focus more on the interest rate policy before we do something on the QE side. And let me just point out certain elements on this reversal interest rate. So when you look at this reversal interest, or more generally on the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, you can see that a cut in interest rate or an increase in interest rate similarly has two effects. On the one hand, if I cut the interest rate, it will actually lead to a capital gain on the bank's balance sheet. So the banks have a lot of long-dated assets, they have a lot of long-dated bonds, and if you cut the interest rates, the value of these bonds will go up. So this actually strengthens the balance sheet of the banks, and then they have more money to lend out to the real economy. On the other hand, if you cut the interest rate, the net interest margin, so the profit the bank makes per loan, is going down. So there's a positive effect and there's a negative effect, and you have to see, which effect is dominating the bank's balance sheet. So if the banks have a lot of long-dated assets, for example, if they have a lot of long-dated Italian bonds on the bank's balance sheet, then the first effect is very powerful. So an interest rate cut is very powerful, and you can sacrifice the effect that the net interest margin is going down. On the other hand, if they don't have so many long-dated bonds, they have more short-dated bonds on the bank's balance sheet, then the net interest margin effect might be the dominating one. So you have to look at these two components and saying, oh, based on this, there will be a reversal rate. Will the reversal rate be 1% or minus 1%? So if you go below, you say minus 1%, it's counterproductive. In some countries, in other countries, might be plus 1%. If you go down there, it's counterproductive. So the things to look out for is really to look at the bank's balance sheets.
Per cui il modo per cui dobbiamo guardare i bilanci delle banche e vedere
what's the interest rate sensitivity of the bank's balance sheet with respect to its current capital gains, bond holdings, and with respect to future profits from the net interest margins. And that's essentially what determines then how low you can go in terms of the interest rate. Can you go down even further, or is it better to come back up again in order to, make the net interest margin better for the banks? And that's essentially the second component I want to say is that let's suppose currently the optimal boundary is, let's say, minus 25 basis points or minus 0.25 percentage points, and you should not go below that. So this would argue let's move up again and at least hit this minus 25 basis points. But over time, this minus 25 basis points doesn't stay constant. It actually creeps up. There's a creeping up effect. Okay, so over time, it will be the case that what was effective initially when you cut the interest rate down, let's say the minus 25 basis points, was very effective, but now over time actually now it's 0%, so you should come back up with the interest rate. And why is that? The best way to see this is in this little chart I've made here. Let's do a hypothetical example. Let's suppose you do some policy for 4 periods. Let's say it's 4 years. And then you have, as I mentioned, there's two effects. If you cut the interest rate, you ruin the profits for the banks going forward because the net interest margin is going down. But you create some capital gains because all the positions on the balance sheet, they gain in value. That's the capital gains effect. But if your bonds are only 2 periods long, in this hypothetical example, the capital gains effect only lasts for 2 periods. After 2 periods, these bonds have matured and then they're gone from the bank's balance sheet. They're replaced with some other new bonds which are priced at the new interest rate. While the net interest margin effect, the profit effect, will last for all of the 4 periods. So what you learn from this simple example is that the net interest margin effect is lasting much, much longer as long as the low interest rate you put on the market, while the capital gains effect only lasts for 2 periods. Or put it differently, after 2 periods, you should actually increase the interest rate again in order to switch off this negative net interest margin effect. Okay. So the interest rate, the reversal rate, is creeping up over time. So again, what you want to do is you look at the bank's balance sheet, you look at the maturity of the bonds they're holding. If this is fairly short, you want to actually come back with your negative interest rate, come to normal levels again. Now, that's essentially for the interest rate. This was the first point I wanted to make. So there's a creeping up effect. So this argues for increasing the short end, increasing the interest rate. Again, the other argument is that okay, instead of increasing the interest rate, we can actually also first stop QE, so we let it run off in December when it, according to newest announcements, is going on. Then there are 2 issues. So one is we have to avoid some taper tantrum, like in the US. When the US announced they will taper the QE, there was a huge unrest in the market. This might happen in Europe as well, so we have to be very careful about that. And then the second step is you could even say, if there is QE, we have bought all these bonds, we can also sell it back to the marketplace. And then the question is, how do we sell it back to the marketplace? So let me first go to the first element, and Lucrezia alluded to this already. So I've plotted here some yield curve, and there's some big debate going on whether, the market is right to do the maturity transformation. Is it actually ideal that the banks take short-term deposits and then lend long-term to firms or other households to get mortgages? Or should some of this maturity transformation be done by the central bank because there's some market failure? And there's a big argument. If this is the case, if the latter is the case, the balance sheet of the central bank should be larger in general. And we should not go back to the old size of the bank's balance sheet. That's a big debate in particular in the US, where the balance sheet really exploded, and some people argue we shouldn't go back to the old size of the bank's balance sheet. But in any case, going back to what we said earlier, if you were to raise the interest rate on the short end of the yield curve, so here on the x-axis you have the maturity, the length, how long it takes until the bond matures. On the y-axis there's the interest rate or the yield of this bond. And you can see one option is to just increase the interest rate, and it's primarily at the short end for short interest rate for a short maturity, which will go up, and the long end will not go up so much. On the other hand, if you stop QE, that actually works differently. It doesn't do so much on the short end because that's pinned down by the policy rate, but then you will have a much steeper yield curve, and the term spread, the difference between the long-term interest rate and the short-term interest rate, will move much more. And that has implications, as I mentioned earlier, for the profits for banks as well, because if there's a term spread, if banks essentially lend long and borrow short, they earn the term spread. So this affects the profits of the banks as well. So you have to calibrate these measures quite extensively to see what measure is better, stopping QE or even undoing QE, or increasing the interest rate, especially on the short rate. So what I will argue later on, and I think we will come back when we come to the governance structure, there's a particular way if you want to stop the purchase of the government bonds and corporate bonds. That's one thing. And if you want to sell off the existing positions the ECB has, or the national central banks have, that in a particular way, and we will argue there's actually a nice way not to sell off the bonds directly, but also to repackage them in a particular way and then sell off packages of a package of national bonds tranched in ways, rather than selling them right straight away.
Thank you very much, and yes, we'll return to that afterwards. It's a very relevant policy discussion, by the way, so it's I would urge you to listen carefully afterwards, but I would go to Jean and ask him about the second question, which actually Lucrezia raised, which is how worried should we be about the ECB exiting QE? Is there a risk of a crisis? Some people are worried of a crisis in Italy, for example, after the end of QE. Or as Lucrezia said, well, growth if the ECB exits, that means that growth is strong, so we shouldn't worry about it.
I will answer. Thank you for this question, but let me go back first to what Lucrezia said, because I think the analysis she provided is important. The paradox of the situation being that we have growth picking up, we have unemployment going down, and we have no significant increase in wages. And I would like to argue that it's actually very good news. On the one hand, it's very good news. On the other hand, it sort of complicates the reading of the situation. The reason why it is very good news is that the sort of conventional wisdom was that unemployment is high for structural reasons in Europe, and that the fact that unemployment is going down means we're going very soon to find ourselves in a situation where wages go up. And this careful analysis by the ECB actually has shown that what matters is not only the unemployment rate on the aggregate, the headline unemployment rate, but also what we call the halo around unemployment. All these people who are at the margin of employment, they are part-time, they are on temporary contracts, etc. And the fact that these people are very numerous in our countries explains in part why wages have significantly underperformed with respect to what was expected, with respect to what sort of traditional forecast would say. But the good news is that it means that these people, they are not excluded from the labor force. They are not out of the labor force, like what has happened in the US, where we have seen a sort of withdrawal from the labor force of some of the unskilled people who just have stopped being counted, and they're inactive. They are on sickness allowances and that sort of thing, and this means they have permanently or more or less permanently withdrawn from the labor force. This has not happened so much in Europe, and that's good news, because this means that we can bring them back into employment, and that means that in terms of the consequences of this crisis is much more favorable. Now, what it also implies is that the sort of speedy exit from QE that some people expected may not be the right policy to follow, and that unconventional monetary policy is here for a bit longer. Remember that it started late. Now, on the exit, let me first say a word about what Markus said. It's interesting, and you may not realize that 10 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the approach of economists about negative interest rates and QE was not at all the same. I mean, there was this view that the sort of the threshold was a zero interest rate, that you couldn't go below the zero interest rate. And in fact, central banks have started testing the zero interest rate and have effectively brought interest rate below zero. And then the question has become, what is really the threshold? And I think what Markus has developed with his reversal rate model is a very interesting approach to what is the threshold in reality that central banks should have in mind, and where is the threshold at which there can be a reversal of the effect of bringing interest rate below zero. So I think that's an indication of how economic research can help understand new phenomenon. Ben Bernanke famously said QE is something that works in practice, but we don't know how it works in theory. And I think slowly, but it has to be slow because it's some work, the theory develops. Now let me end on your question. I think we should be looking at what's happening in the US, in the UK, in countries which have exited from QE, because they started earlier. They started much earlier, actually. You said the ECB started late. And so the normalization is far ahead as in comparison to the Eurozone. And in the US, the asset purchases ended in the autumn of 14. Interest rate increases began in the first quarter of 16. So we have some evidence to look at, and the evidence is that inflation-adjusted real interest rates for long-term interest rates are still extremely low. They are remarkably low compared to what they were before the crisis. So essentially, they are about 0.5% at present, whereas they were 2.5% 10 years ago. So this indicates that something has happened in between. What is it? Is it something that's due to the lagged effect of QE? Or more likely, is it something that's due to some fundamental changes in the global economy that explain why we're having so low long-term interest rates? And the more we look at it, the more the evidence grows that changes in the saving behavior, changing in the investment behavior, and changes in the balance between the two and the demand for assets explain why we're seeing this type of situation. So the savings behavior that a number of countries are saving more. The Eurozone is saving much, much more. The Eurozone has become a major saver in the world economy, in part because of its internal adjustment, and the fact that its internal adjustment has been essentially that the low-saving economies have adjusted their savings upward, and the high-saving economy, especially Germany, has actually continued increasing its saving. but other parts of the world have contributed too. Second, investment is rather low, and investment is rather low for a combination of relatively low growth rates, which have implication for investment, but also perhaps the fact that the economy is less, or growth is less investment intensive than it was before. And finally, we have this demand for safe assets that is high in the world because of the growth of the emerging countries. Safe assets are a scarcity in the global economy. They are produced by a few economies in the world. Emerging economies typically do not produce what we call safe assets, so that bonds that can be relied on because of the quality of the legal system, because of the liquidity of the bond market, because of the stability of economic policies. Those are things that are difficult to combine because it's actually a sort of result of a high level of development. So we have an economy, global economy, in which the emerging world has grown tremendously compared to what it was before. I mean, we had an emerging world that represented about 40% of the global economy 20 years ago. Now it's 60% of the global economy. And they are demanding safe assets. And the developed world is producing these safe assets, but the demand for them has grown tremendously. So the result is low interest rates. And so we are in an environment in which, for these reasons, which are structural, which have actually nothing to do with monetary policy, with QE, we are in this low interest rate environment. If this is correct, and that's something that it's still disputed. Some people say the opposite. Some people have the view that it's all due to monetary policy, and that they're going high interest rates are going to come back with a revenge. But the evidence, it seems to me that there is something structural going on there. If this is correct, this means that the exit from QE, will mean much less of a return to the sort of previous state of affair that people anticipate, that relatively low interest rates are here to stay. Now, this doesn't mean that in terms of the risk appetite and the valuation of risk, we're not going to see some degree of normalization, because QE has worked as an anesthetic with respect to risk aversion. So this means that inside the euro area, there can be a different appreciation of the risk involved in the various bonds issued by sovereigns. And this brings us to the question I think we want to discuss now, which is what does it imply for the euro area, and how the euro area should get ready for a different type of environment.
Well, that's the question I'm going to ask Lucrezia to answer first, and it's basically, you've done a lot of work on this question with a number of colleagues. What's needed? We know there are lots of things which the Eurozone should do in theory, but many of these ideas are politically very difficult to sell to some countries. People talk often about Eurobonds, which have a mutual guarantee, but obviously mention Eurobonds in Germany and you will get a lot of bad replies. And so my question is for you is, what's the minimum level of integration which we need for the Eurozone to work, and which at the same time is also politically acceptable in all Eurozone countries?
Well, always the easy questions to me, right? So that, okay, so let me just first with just some very general principle. I think that whatever one thinks about the detail of exiting, timing, forms of exiting and so on, it is clear that we cannot ask a central bank to do everything, okay? And because the ECB is the only federal institution that we have, it has become sort of the institution of last resort, okay? So whenever other parties cannot get their act together, then the ECB has to intervene. This has been the history of the crisis. I think that now we are going towards a gradual normalization, but it's also a moment in which the other parties, so governments, have to start taking their responsibilities. And in my view, we have to think, exactly like Ferdinando said, we shouldn't think of doing too much, all of a sudden having, common welfare state, common unemployment insurance, common this and common that, because this is just not feasible. There is not enough appetite, in the community of the Eurozone to go for this is one bank federation. So we have to start thinking about what is the minimal set of reforms that we need to implement in order to ensure financial stability. Now, there is a bunch of things that we have to do, and they have to do with migration, security, blah, blah, blah. Here we are talking about the Eurozone, so a subset of the EU, so the countries we share the common currencies. So for these countries, there is a need to do more, because sharing sovereignty, which is basically means to have the same money, implies also that we are much more tied together in financial markets and also on the fiscal sphere. So what can we do to do the minimum? What can we do so that if there is going to be another crisis tomorrow, we are not going to be found ourselves unprepared? I think this is the way to phrase this question. So if you had to ask me, of course it doesn't make any sense to ask me because, I don't have any responsibility, but if I were in charge, I would say the following. I think that the fiscal framework based on rules, only on rules, has not worked very well. These rules were very tough ex ante, but then, when the crisis comes, rules, nobody follow them. So we have to start thinking about a framework which is less based on rules and a little bit more on discretion, which is similar, if you want, to something that, the so-called French point of view, okay, with referring to, to the debate that the presentation of the book by Markus and other economists that was presented yesterday. However, if we want to go in the direction of more discretions, then we have to allow the market to enforce discipline. We cannot say, for example, no states will ever be bailed out, all banks will be saved, and so on and so forth. We cannot have it both. So if we have to have less rules, we have to have mechanisms which allow the market to vote again, when, some entities, states, banks, and so on are clearly insolvent, we have to allow the market to do their work. So to me, like if we were in a kind of optimal world, coming from zero, then I would say we need a set of institutions. For example, we need a debt restructuring mechanism that would allow countries if they come to insolvency, to restructure, and we need to have the rules and to know the rules ex ante, so that we don't get in a mess like in the case of Greece, in which it was not clear what we were doing. Eventually we restructured, we went through a huge restructuring, but we did it in the, putting a lot of uncertainty because it took time, the rules were not clear, and so on. And at the end, with Greece, what happened? We ended up in the worst possible situation, in which we lend excessively to insolvency, and at the same time, but we asked the Greek to do an adjustment type of policies that actually killed the economy. So I think it would be, in a steady state, in an optimal world, it would be better to have a scheme which would have a preventive leg, so when countries get close to that area of insolvency, we'll start discussing about reforms, and then if they really get there, then we sit around the table, and with a set of rules which are known ex ante, we organize a restructuring. Now, also, I would say that in the steady state, you would need a safe asset. What does it mean to have a safe asset? It means that right now, what is the safe asset for the euro area is the treasury bonds for the German state. Now, the Bund is a safe asset, and this creates a lot of distortion, because whenever there is tensions in the market, everybody goes and buys the German Bund, so the interest rates in Germany are extremely low, And, this creates a bias that has to be corrected. And so to have a safe asset, we have to think about some financial engineering which will involve bundling the sovereign bonds of different states. And there are proposals on the table, and Markus has been a very forceful proponent of this kind of approach, in which regulation will be changed so that the market will be encouraged to bundle the sovereign bonds from different states and in a synthetic bonds, which would then be tranche, and where the risk. Where there will be a seniority tranche, a mezzanine, and a junior tranche. And so I think that Markus will want to talk more in detail about this thing. Now, to do these two things, is not that easy. Debt restructuring and safe asset, it means that countries which have high debt, like Italy, or which have banks which have in their balance sheet stuff like Italian government bonds or Portuguese government bonds and so on, if we go straight into that kind of steady state new situation, we will be hit, The Italians will be hit, the Portuguese will be hit, so there we will create a lot of volatility in the market. So the compromise with the Germans to say, we go to these synthetic bonds in which there will be some risk attached to bonds from countries which are more unsafe, like, for example, Italy or Portugal and so on, and we'll have that restructuring, which is something that the Germans would like. However, the compromise should be that we get institutions which help in the transition. So institutions like, for example, the European Stability Mechanism that will cope with this kind of volatility. And here again, there are a number of proposals in the table, enhancing the European Stability Mechanism, making it like a really proper stability funds, which will be allowed to buy back debt and issue debt guarantee for joint, guaranteed by the governments with some schemes which will evolve maybe future fiscal resources in a combination with current maybe increasing taxation in certain areas. So I don't want to get here in the details, not to kill the audience, but I mean the basic concept is think of a new concept which would be, probably create a lot of volatility in the short term, but enhance our institution and particularly the European Stability Mechanism in order to cope with volatility. To do that will imply some risk sharing. So will imply that the Germans have to accept the concept of a minimal risk sharing. Without that, and I'm not talking here about a Eurobond, I'm talking here about something slightly different. I think that this could be a basis for a compromise. So I wish that Monsieur Macron or whatever, because the Italians are not at the table anyway, so we'll go in this direction.
Just a very small question for you, because there was something I was expecting you to mention, but didn't come. It's about bail-in, which, as we know, is a big subject.
Of course,
so in Italy,
the Italians only care about bail-in.
So in your ward, when Lucrezia REICHLIN is dictator of Europe, is there space for bail-in or not?
Of course, there is space for bail-in. However, I think that the new banking union has been designed without thinking of the transition. So the bail-in rules in countries which are still weighted by legacy issues, and our country, in the banking sector, not only banking sector, also in the fiscal public sector, has that problem. So these bail-in rules, in my view, don't work. So I think, however, that to cry against Europe and saying, the Germans have used their money and we are not allowed to use our money and so on, is very counterproductive. I think that we should work in collaboration with Europe, first of all, to have a national solution to that. I think that when there is a crisis, the state has to be allowed to intervene and recapitalize banks. The US have done it. A lot of countries have done it successfully. This should not be, however, a blank guarantee that every stupid bank has to be saved, okay? So the governance is very, very important. And I think to have maybe national and European governance on a recapitalization funds and an asset management company which would, buy the NPLs and repackage and sell them in the market. I mean, I think we could work as Italy on such scheme. We have been very late. I don't know what they're doing, why they are not working on that scheme. And this could be maybe the blueprint for something that then we could work at the European level.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to Markus, because Lucrezia rightly mentioned this idea of which are called SBs, European Safe Bonds, which are one of the big ideas which Markus has been working on. I should also mention, I've forgotten, that Markus written this great book, which in English is called The Euro and the Battle of Ideas, which has just come out in Italian, and is precisely about that debate between rules and discretion, which has dominated, really, Eurozone integration for decades, and which I all urge you to read, because it's fascinating. But going back to SBs, can you tell us a little bit about them? Why are they so important? Because this week, the European Commission included them in a policy proposal, which obviously still needs to be debated by governments. We know these things take time, but it's in this document, which means that actually it's not just an academic dream, but it's really very much at the center of the policy debate. So tell us a little bit more about them.
Thanks a lot. So essentially let me come back to the book. I mean, the book essentially says, there are different economic philosophies across Europe, and people think very differently. And what the book tries to do is to contrast these philosophies, and also then let's think about solutions which are consistent with both philosophies. So first, let's try to understand each other much better. And second, there might be some solutions which work under both philosophies. And the SBs, or what's now called SBBS, so the sovereign bond-backed securities, you can still pronounce it SBs, they're essentially is one of these solutions where you can actually, on the one hand, you satisfy both philosophies. On the other hand, you also provide some solution to certain problems. So if we can go back to the slides. So essentially what the idea is of the SBs essentially is that you would bundle sovereign bonds, let's say in the long run up to 60% of GDP, so according to the ECB key or according to some GDP weight over a 5-year moving average. And then you bundle this in a synthetic bond. Essentially, you have diversified the risk, and after you have diversified the risk, you issue the special purpose vehicle, or whoever is doing that, issue a senior bond and a junior bond. And the purpose of the junior bond is to protect the senior bond. So whenever there's something is going wrong, there is some restructuring or some losses on one country or the other country, these losses will be captured by the junior bond. So we did a lot of simulations, and we have shown, if the junior bond is 30%, it will really capture, it will protect enough the senior bond. So the senior bond is a safe asset because it's protected by the junior bond. So unlike a Eurobond, where the Eurobond is protected by joint liability, by joint guarantee, which is very much against the German principle of this liability principle, that the person who gets into debt is also liable for the debt. Here, the senior bond is protected by the junior bond. So there's no joint liability, and hence it's consistent with the German philosophy. It's also consistent with the sense of risk-sharing solidarity, which is very much in the French tradition. And what happens then, essentially, if there's default, the junior bond will eat the losses, so it will be shocked by the losses, but this senior bond is protected. So we proposed this in 2011, a group of economists across of Europe, we called ourselves the Euronomics Group, and pushed it from then onwards and have worked out the details. But let me just highlight two problems this bond proposal would solve. The first one is this diabolic loop between sovereign risk and banking risk. And actually two diabolic loops. So the first one everybody talks about, if the sovereign debt is getting more into troubles and difficulties, and banks have a lot of the sovereign debt on the asset side of their balance sheet, then the banks are in difficulties as well. They make losses, and hence the government has to potentially bail out these banks because they made these losses. And because the government has to bail them out. The government paper, the sovereign bond, is in more difficulties again, and there you have this loop going around. But there's an even more important loop. The second loop is if the government pushes the sovereign bonds into the banks will not lend to the real economy, because the bank is lending to the government and not to the real economy, and the banks make losses if something goes wrong. Then they stop lending to the real economy, and then the real economy tanks, and as the real economy tanks, the tax revenue goes down, and that hurts the fiscal authorities or the government as well, and then you have another loop going on. So you have two loops. One is this bailout loop, and the other one is the credit to the real economy loop. So both loops connect the sovereign risk with the banking risk. And the question is, how can we break this diabolic loop? And if the banks are holding these SPs, the senior bonds, then you break this diabolic loop, because the senior bonds are really the safe part of the sovereign debt. And the junior bonds has to be held outside of the banking system. Insurance companies, hedge funds, and others, and even private households can hold the junior bond, but it shouldn't be in the banking system. The other problem is with the safe asset, and Lucrezia alluded to this as well, that at the moment Germany has a sort of a monopoly on the safe asset in Europe. So it's not supplied symmetrically across the euro area. So Germany is supplying it, and that has the advantage whenever there's a crisis, there will be flight to safety, and the flight to safety will lead to flight to safety across borders. So from the peripheral countries into Germany, and Germany has a very low interest rate, peripheral countries have a very high interest rate, and this leads to volatility in the interest rate moving around. What this new bond proposal would do is would rechannel this flight to safety capital flows. Instead of going across borders, they will go across asset classes. They will go from the junior bond to the senior bond. But both bonds are European, so they're not going cross-border anymore. So this rechannels the whole flight to safety capital flows and stabilizes things, because it doesn't benefit one country at the expense of the other country, but both are European bonds. So it goes from the European junior bond to the European senior bond. And these are the two things which would the SPs or the SBBS would solve down the road. It would not solve all aspects, and it shouldn't solve all aspects of the euro crisis, but I think these are two main components it would solve. Now, I would like to come back, how could one implement these bonds? And there are different ways to do that, and we have written a whole paper on that. There are many details which need to be sorted out. But one way to implement is that when the ECB gets out of QE, and to such an extent that it will sell off bonds, not to sell off individual bonds, so it doesn't sell off the Italian bonds, the German bonds, and throws it back to the market, but then rather than throwing back, it repackages them into the senior bond and the junior bond, and then it sells these packages back into the market. And this way you establish the market. To establish a new market is always a huge coordination problem. You have to get all bankers on board, and then there has to be some liquidity and trading going on. And then you would really, by undoing QE, you would immediately, by doing this, you would establish the new market. So that's the idea, essentially, coming back. One thing was the interest rate policy, and the other thing was the quantitative easing, undoing quantitative easing. If you really want to undo it, we think it's a more clever way to repackage these bonds the ECB is holding and sell it off back into the senior bond and a junior bond.
Thank you very much. And we're going to have just a final question to Jean PISANI-FERRY before we open it to the floor. So I would like you to comment on what's just been said, but also if you can add a little bit of, you've been very close to the political scene as in your role as advisor to President Macron. Where do you see the candidates and now president? Where do you see the kind of political debate going? Are the stars aligning for greater Eurozone integration, or we are getting a little bit too excited and there are still big obstacles ahead?
I would start from I think the high degree of convergence between the three of us, basically between what Lucrezia and what Markus. Exactly, yeah, and I agree with a lot of what has been said with the fundamentals. And I think it's not by accident. So over the years, among economists, we've discussed many options, and gradually something is emerging that I think among people like us, looks like a sort of sensible solution. And Lucrezia outlined the components, more discretion, less rules, but then more responsibility for individual member countries, a mechanism to deal with a situation of insolvency. That requires also then having a safe asset that is a common safe asset, and break the bank sovereign loop that has been at the root of the crisis and is still there. And then we all agree that the transition is delicate. So we can discuss the detail, and we can perhaps disagree on the detail, but on the broad outline, I think we essentially agree. Now, is the political discussion there? I would say no, it is not. It is not. The discussion at political level is still far from what we are discussing here. We have sort of very stubborn national positions. So in Italy, you would never accept discussing debt restructuring. In Germany, you would never accept having safe asset that's commonly designed, because it would look like a common guarantee and a recipe for transfers. And I think in France, you would much more put the emphasis on the institutions and less on the system, and perhaps more on the on stabilization. And there is also an aversion to discussing debt restructuring. So I think the challenge is sort of whether a political discussion based on the sort of underlying element that we are discussing here is possible. I do think it is possible, but I do think it requires being much more genuine about what has to be built. It requires a commitment on all sides. So perhaps that's something we're going to see, and perhaps the conversation can start because precisely there is more commitment on keeping the euro area together, on going beyond the obvious national red lines to save the euro area. I think what Chancellor Merkel said when she said we are now reacting to the G7 and to the decision by President Trump, emphasizing that we are on our own, and that's a broad statement that we have to take our destiny in our own hands. That's something important. I think the commitment by now President Macron to Europe is something important, but a lot of work needs to be done. To me, it's important to start from the end goal. The transition and the current situation are all full of difficulties, because we know from the history, and Markus wrote on that, from this history of international monetary and financial relations, that distributional issues are terrible to deal with. Each time a country perceives itself as being on the creditor side and another country on the debtor side, it's becoming a purely distributional issue, and so the creditor doesn't want to concede anything because that would mean paying money to the debtor. I think we have to recreate some sort of veil of ignorance, focusing on the long-term goal, and knowing that what we are speaking about, banking crisis. Remember that Ken Rogoff said that banking crises are equal opportunity menaces. So we've had banking crises in all type of countries, rich and poor, developed or not, financially developed or financially underdeveloped. So that's what we have to deal with, to strengthen the euro area and to make it able to withstand such crises. Now, having worked on the sort of the long-term design, then there can be obviously negotiation, a discussion to approach the transition. Let me add a few words on one thing that, on two things that I think are important. One is this issue of why we need to accept more the debt restructuring and move away from reliance on strict rules. Partly because the system of rules that has been built has become much too complex and has lost traction with respect to national decision makers. No member of parliament in whatever country understands the details and the implication, the full implication of the system of rules we have in place. We're having conversations that focus on one particular aspect, which is the aspect of the rules that actually is binding at a particular moment in time. So in France, we're discussing about the 3% rule. In Italy, it's about the debt dimension. But the whole system is simply not understood and not taken on board by national decision makers. That's one reason. The other one is that the political climate we're in means that it is likely to be extremely difficult to constrain a country in which the political mood would be basically a mood of resistance, of refusal of the rule system. And this has happened, this can happen again. And we have to recognize that market discipline is sort of more acceptable politically, because you don't negotiate with markets. It's basically something you have to, it's a reality. Whereas if you just have to accept what the Commission is telling you, or what the Council is telling you, they are partners, so you want to negotiate politically. So I think we have to recognize that. But then, if there is more responsibility at national and there is more autonomy at national level, there must be more responsibility, and there must be mechanisms to deal with situations of unsustainable fiscal situation. Then the question of the safe asset becomes essential, because you cannot. You described, Lucrezia, the situation in which the German Bund would be the safe asset for the whole.
No. I totally agree with Markus on the boundary.
Yeah, no, I agree. But you describe as a possibility. I mean, rejecting it, but rejecting it. But you discuss. I mean, this. I mean, this can be an outcome of a situation where the German Bund become the safe asset. That would be both financially and politically extremely difficult to accept as a solution. Also creating responsibilities for Germany that would come from the fact that Germany would acquire sort of hegemonic position in the euro area. So the creation of a common safe asset is essential. Now, Eurobonds, sort of original Eurobonds, would require a rule-based system, because if you're giving your guarantee to your neighbor, you want that your neighbor abides by rules. So the fact that we're saying we have to accept there is more discretion means the sort of traditional, the standard Eurobond is less feasible. Although the Eurobonds, I mean, I was at Bruegel, I was not the author, but I published the original Eurobond proposal, and it involved the kind of synthetic asset and the sort of junior senior bond structure that Markus is thinking of, because the idea with the Eurobond would be the safe part, and the junior part would be of the responsibility of the individual member state. So somehow it's the same structure. Now, just to finish on that, on the particulars of the SBs, there are things to discuss. I mean, there are various variants of solutions of this type, some of which would be purely market-based, some of which would have more of an institutional backing. And actually, if you want this asset to be actually considered a safe asset, it probably needs an institutional backing of some sort. And there are issues with the volume of safe asset that would be issued, how much is needed to make sure that it could replace national bonds in the portfolio of banks. So the question of how you can produce, how much you can produce synthetically, all those issues are worth discussion. But I think, again, on the fundamentals, I would conclude that there's a lot of agreement on the fundamentals.
Excellent. Thank you very much to all our panelists. So we'll, prendiamo qualche domanda dal pubblico, se potete cortesemente dire chi siete, e ne prendo 3 e poi magari facciamo un altro giro.
So we can take 3 questions from the audience first.
Dietro. Sì.
Good morning, Giorgio Sbampato. Some of the discussion in the panel today reminded me there was a US president that requested only one-handed economist in his team. But the question I wanted to ask more on more serious note is, can we read something into the numbers that have been coming out of the Target 2 flows in the last several months?
Grazie, mi chiamo Pietro Pernetti. Due considerazioni veloci. L'inflazione serve ad annacquare
i debiti. Couple of quick remarks. Inflation is a way to water down debt, and we said that 2% was set as a target by the EBC following the heritage of Germany at the beginning of 1900, where high inflation rates had a number of very bad implications. Then wages and oil currently are not helping, but in the long term, oil will certainly not help, considering that renewable energy is growing substantially. So what do you think the EBC should do to balance the low interest rates and the purchase of securities, considering that the level of debt of European member states is different, so different debt levels, so different need to water down the debt? And then there are banks that have different percentages of NPLs on their balance sheets. So my question to Brunnermeier, who is an expert in speculative bubbles, so do you expect a speculative bubble may materialize on the securities of the peripheral countries in the Eurozone? So a sudden widening of the spread should the tapering start? Thank you very much. So last question. So first of all, congratulations for your contributions. My question is the following. Do you think it is necessary to exit the quantitative easing so quickly? In Europe it started only 2 years ago, and in the US it lasted 6 years. The weaknesses that are still there are well known, so prolonging the quantitative easing could be a good idea perhaps. And the SPs, I believe, are a nice tool. So do you think we really have to exit the quantitative easing so quickly, considering that the Germans have always been in a hurry? You have referred to history, and Trento has always been, let's say, an intermediary between the Latin world and the German world. So don't you think we should slow down this process before we get to the end of the quantitative easing?
We have 3 questions. One on Target 2, should we worry about it? Is 2, do we need to NQE now? 3 is how to balance rate increases and QE, and is there a bubble on Eurozone peripheral debt? So I would say 1 each. So Lucrezia, your pick. No, actually, the last question is for Markus, I think. Yes.
I don't know. On Target 2, well, I mean, Target 2 is... I mean, what you're referring to is that the position that Italy and Spain have developed big spikes on our debt position vis-à-vis Germany, and this actually is something that happened to the crisis, then it kind of disappeared when the crisis, the financial stability issues were sort of semi-solved, and now it has come back again, partly as an effect of QE. So it's partly a technical issue, but it reveals the fact that banks, buy these bonds and then they redeposit in banks in countries which are safer. So this is not a big issue if the euro remains the euro. Of course, it has only a potential risk for creditors in the case the euro will disintegrate. So again, it's a matter of trust, okay, so that if we'll manage to save the euro, if between Mario Draghi, us, or, you know, our governments, then I think this is just technical. Who cares about target 2 imbalances? It's just an effect of our system of payments. But of course, if you think that there is a positive probability that the euro area will disintegrate, then, you know, once disintegration will take place, then we'll have to settle, and the creditor countries will take a hit.
Okay. So do we need to end QE? Or should we wait?
I would say the QE, as we said, has been introduced for the euro area as a whole in view of the situation of the euro area as a whole. So in this respect, the fact that inflation, core inflation is picking up slowly, the fact that we're seeing this sort of ongoing wage moderation indicate that unconventional monetary policy may be warranted for longer than expected a few months ago, or when the ECB started alluding to exit. Now, there are negative effects of QE. I think I would mention 2 of them. One is particular to certain countries. Let's say, it's especially, Germany, which is close to full employment, in which interest rates are very low, and that savers are not happy with this kind of situation. Now, I would say the ECB is bound to decide on these matters as on traditional monetary policy with respect to the situation in the euro area as a whole, and the asymmetries that are inherited from the crisis cannot be solved by moving to a different type of policies that would be more suited to certain countries and less to other countries. It has to stick to its mandate. The other part, which is sort of more common, is the fact that this kind of environment may have side effects that are undesirable in terms of capital allocation, in terms of the quality of investment that is made by private agents. Those are issues that have to be traded off against the macro justifications for QE. So my answer would be it has to be based on the very same objective that the ECB has put forward from the start, the inflation target and the ability to reach it.
Let me just add a few sentences on the other 2 questions as well. So on target 2 flows, indeed, they went up again, and I know several people in France, for example, who actually moved some money out of France into Germany because there was a danger of Le Pen taking over, and they were worried about their positions. And that's why target 2 went up again. Of course, in Italy there's uncertainty too, and it has implications if the euro breaks up, but it has also implications if it doesn't break up, because it changes the bargaining position of Germany, in the sense that the threat of leaving the euro is firing back to Germany, and they're aware that even the bargaining might be affecting dramatically whether a country has to leave or not. On the inflation watering down debt, I think there's good inflation, there's bad inflation. I mean, typically everybody puts everything together, but oil in particular, if there's high inflation because of oil, it doesn't help anybody within the euro area. It helps primarily the oil-producing countries. And so you essentially you erode purchasing power within the euro area with high oil inflation. There's other inflation where you might say, oh, this might help to get rid of debt. That's another way of taxing people. But you only tax people who have locked in existing bond positions with a long maturity, because the new bond prices will actually react to that. So you have to pay a high interest rate, a high nominal interest rate, which will reflect the high inflation rate. So you will actually only hurt the bondholders with a long maturity. And this depends, how much the Italian government or any government has extended the maturity, and they have extended the maturity, so it helps to some extent. On the exiting QE, I think there's some technical limits as well. So what the ECB is very concerned, they don't want to hold more than a third of total outstanding government debt. So in certain countries, in particular in Portugal, that's an issue because they were already involved in the SMP program very early on. They bought a big chunk of that, and then they bought QQE more, and they're hitting their limits. So they don't want to take over and be the market maker and determining the price totally on this. They still want to have a liquid market in these places, and that's some constraint which is playing in as well. And as Jean pointed out, QE has a very characteristic feature that it's actually determining the inflation rate, so it's targeting the inflation rate on the euro area wide basis. So it's not country specific. So it always is forced to do it according to the ECB key. So you have to buy up debt across all the countries. If you go for country-specific programs, that's the OMT program, but that comes then together with conditionality. So you can imagine that if QE will be retired, that for certain countries the yield is going up. There is a danger, I wouldn't rule this out. But then we have the OMT to move in instead and then stabilize this particular country, but this comes then together with the ESM and conditionality. Okay, one has to be aware of that, and that's also to some extent countries have to prepare for themselves. When the QE goes out, there might be some spikes, but the ECB can still intervene, but then a conditionality might come in as well.
Okay, I think we can end this very stimulating. Last question? Yes, let's take it, and then just one, and then.
Buongiorno, Bruno Kaiserman. Una domanda velocissima, approfitto della presenza
I have a very quick question, taking advantage of the panelists who are here with us, since they have created, and this was a surprise, not only the French-German axis, but the French-German-Italian axis. This is a wonderful opportunity.
Detto questo, una domanda
Having
molto
said this, I have a very short question. We've been hearing about rules and much more.
Ed è sullo scenario, sullo sfondo che è rimasto dietro, ne scusi nessuno, forse per paura o per pudore o per giustamente correttezza del titolo non ha parlato. E se si parlasse di sentire l'opinione, cioè scusi, se si volessi sentire l'opinione di questi tre illustri relatori, Euro 1 e Euro 2, quanto c'è di vero?
I mean, how much is true in Euro 1 and Euro 2, the two speeds of Europe?
The question is about whether it's possible to have a two-speed euro, not two-speed EU, but a two-speed euro, 2 euros.
Well, I mean, I just start and then I think it would be a very bad idea. I mean, in a way, it's an old idea. I mean, we will go back to a situation very similar to what was the system, I mean, similar to what was the situation in the 80s and in the 90s, in which, we would have to, I mean, we would either fluctuate completely or maybe fluctuates in a band, okay? So we will have to discuss, And remember that in the situation in which we were fluctuating within a band, given the interaction between our economies, in any case, the Bundesbank, the central bank in Germany, had a leadership position, so that we could not totally disregard the monetary policy of the Bundesbank and the level of the exchange rate in Germany, because too much fluctuations in the exchange rate, in some situation because we were actually bounded by fixed exchange rate, but also if we had been in an inflexible exchange rate, excessive volatility of exchange rate would have not been, it's not a very good idea for economies which are very integrated. So I think that a situation in which we participate to the government council, to the collective decision of the euro area, it's a better situation, and we went there exactly to cope with the problems that we had when we did not have a monetary union. So I think that a better proposal is to try to complete our institution to make the euro, a much more stable currency with, the kind of things we have discussed around this table.
To put it short, I wouldn't want to choose between Lucrezia and Markus. And I don't think let's take a very French perspective on that. For France would simply, not want to be part of a monetary union without Germany, nor could it be part of a monetary union with Germany without Italy. I mean, that's as simple as that. It wouldn't work. It would just break up entirely.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the euro would break up entirely. I think this multi-speed euro is problematic also. There's a huge misperception out there that, you know, everything is the fault of the euro. I think there are a lot of problems in each country which are not really, you can easily blame the euro, but it's not really the euro which is to blame for. So just to give you some analogies, so often it is said, you know, there was huge capital inflows into peripheral countries before the euro crisis broke out, and this actually caused all the problems. But there were also huge capital inflows into Romania, which is part of the European Union, but not part of the euro. There were also huge capital inflows into Serbia, which is not even part of the European Union. So this capital inflows into peripheral countries was not specific to the euro. And imagine if there would have been the same crisis for Italy without the euro. Can you imagine what would have happened? The exchange rate would have gone through the roof, and many companies and banks would have gone bust because of the exchange rate movements. I think with the risk sharing which is going on through Target 2 and other mechanisms inside the euro, Italy was actually doing way better than it would have done outside. There's this misperception, you know, if the euro were not there, everything would be rosy, the alternative scenario. I think this is something, you know, that's very important in political debate to make this clear. If you get out of the euro, you will be on your own, and this will be a worse world. It's not clear at all that this will be, you know, much better than the current situation is.
Well. Markus, you may have a career as a politician in Italy if you ever get bored of being an economist in the US. But anyway, please join me in thanking our guest speakers, and thank you very much for being here today. Grazie a tutti.